costing you want to talk about. In my mind, I think in terms of kind of two areas of that, theoretical and actual costing. I plan to cover both. If you can think of something else, feel free. So fundamentally, we support really any costing method that your accounting system is supporting, which are the typicals, FIFO, average, standard. Those are the ones we see typically. Some of the applications, and I kind of have to be a little vague because I don't even know, is everybody GP here? Is anybody not GP? SL?
NAV.
And NAV, right, thank you.
SL.
Okay, we got everybody here, great. So I'm going to refer to the ERP as Dynamics, and that'll keep everybody simple. As far as this conversation is concerned, there really isn't any difference between the applications. So when I say Dynamics, it's all going to be basically the same. So we'll talk a bit about the cost components. We'll start with theoretical costing, and then we'll go into actual costing. And then I'll give you some insight as to what we're doing as we move forward over the next handful of months, especially on the GP side, and we'll see where that rolls out in the SL and the NAV side as we move forward, having to do with adjusting costs and things like that. So, costs. The cost components, I think, are fairly straightforward. We've got raw material costs is one piece of it to know about. And what we call additional costs, which could be anything you want to apply, labor, overhead, whatever. And then packaging costs. And I'm going to talk about each one of those and kind of how those impact the system from a theoretical as well as an actual basis. But those are the primary cost components that I can think of. Let me get this guy back. Get rid of my auto hide. Obnoxious. There we go. Okay. So probably the easiest way to kind of go through this is to talk a bit about from a theoretical cost perspective. I'll start with the cost roll-up, which, by the way, you'll hear tomorrow specifically that the cost roll-up is moving from V2 to V4 in this next release, which is in June. So this may be the last focus. I have to show this in V2 for terms. Let's see what my products are here. I think I'm going to stay in the beer company at least for a while because I've got a lot of data configured there. So I'm just bringing up the cost roll-up. I'll show you how this runs in a minute. Don't worry about the details on this for a second. I just want to bring it up so that we can talk about data elements. So this is a cost roll-up as kind of summarized for one single item. It happens to be for a 12-ounce bottle of beer is what we're looking at. A couple things I want to point out in my demo database is that I've got a multi-level bill of material here. So I've got packaging, which is the bottle, the label, the case, the crown, etc., and so on the top level. Just so that you understand my data, in brewing, they go through a three-step process. They brew to get to an intermediate. That intermediate is fermented for a while, so it sits on hand in a fermenter for a while, and then it turns into bright beer, which is yet another intermediate. So they go through a two-intermediate process in brewing. And that's what you're seeing here in these multi-levels that we've got here. So that's the first intermediate is bright beer. To make bright beer, they make wort, and to make wort, they use all that. So that's just an understanding of the data. So in talking about some of the data components that we have for costing, on the far right, you can see a type of cost. You see the first 5 items or so are bill of material components. Those are, most people would think of those as packaging. In this case, they are assigned at the finished good level. So when I set up a component, when I set up an inventory item, specifically in the subcomponent section of component entry, we can define what bill of material goes associated with each finished product. So for a stocking unit of measure of this finished good, which happens to be an each, which happens to be a case, for an each, it takes this number of each of these items. The purpose of this conversation is mostly around this unit cost, and we're going to spend our time talking about where that comes from. But that's one data element to talk about, is the bill of material component. We also have got what we call a bill of material runtime or setup cost, an additional cost. So the idea is at the finished good level, I can associate additional costs for every finished good produced. So it's kind of an output application model. So based on the number of cases that I make, I will apply a certain number of dollars per case being put on hand. And that's what you're seeing here. And I'm going to go through and show you where these things are set up. But that's another kind of data element, is I can associate any additional costs that I want to, and as many additional costs as I want to, against any given finished good based on output. Below that, where I have formula ingredients, those are probably pretty obvious. Those are the raw materials that are going into the process. And we're going to be talking about sources of costs here in just a moment. But those are the data elements there. And then finally on the bottom of this screen, actually got a couple, bottom screen next to bottom, I've got an additional cost associated with the formula. So we already talked about having an additional cost associated with a finished good or an output. So packaging cost as an example. But I can also associate additional costs based on the blend or the mix. So that might be labor, mixing labor, processing labor. I'm not talking about packaging now because that probably would have been associated with a finished good. But processing labor associated with converting the raw material could also be machine time. So it's not uncommon for people to, as you start getting more specific in your costing, is think in terms of a vessel that the product is in and what is the cost per day of that vessel, and then allocate costs based on number of days that vessel is being used. Whether that could go down to hours if you wanted to. The scenario I use in breweries is it's typically in a fermenter for, call it 15 days. So each day it's in there, it allocates a certain number of dollars per day. So there could be an application rate associated with a day and associate that many hours. Same thing for chemical companies. It's in that it's in that mixing tank or the grinder or letdown tank, etc. for a certain period of time. You could allocate costs associated with that time if you wanted to do that. So the difference I'm trying to differentiate is there are costs associated with the finished product or the output as well as against the formula. You can use either or both. When we design the application, the architecture of the application is to say, theoretically, if you make multiple finished goods from the same mixture, it would probably be more accurate to put the costs associated with the formula that is formula cost, because that becomes an entire bucket of costs for that batch, no matter what comes out of it. Here's the cost to make that liquid that you're about to package, and then separate out packaging costs, because a 1 gallon container versus a 55 gallon container versus a tote versus a rail car will all have different costs per unit to fill, and separate out filling from mixing. And that was the concept. Now, in practical terms, what most people do, especially in overhead, is they think based on the finished goods they get out, and they take all costs and allocate it to the finished goods coming out, which is okay. It's actually not a bad way to start, because most of us, when we start budgeting, think in terms of what's my production for next year? How many units am I planning to make? Maybe it's pounds or eaches or whatever. I know what my denominator is. I know my numerator. I know the cost that I want to allocate for the year. Talking overhead for a minute, I've got $1 million of costs that I want to allocate, and I've got 100,000 units that are going to come out. I now have a quick allocation for a number of units I want to produce. So that's how most people start. In other words, they start by assigning the cost up here at the finished product against the component. And then they would take that and drive that down to the formula as they get more advanced. Okay? So those are the cost components. Those are the places in which some costs can come into play. Any questions on kind of where they can get assigned? And we're going to go into detail on how you assign them in just a minute. Am I missing any that you can think of that in your application? Okay. I'll tell you one that we don't do that I think is a reasonable. What we're not doing is taking an outside vendor's cost and taking the invoice from an outside vendor's cost and applying it to a batch. We're not doing that. What we will do is apply a standard rate, say toll manufacturer. You've got somebody co-packing for you or tolling the product for you. We can allocate like one of these costs. You can set up an additional cost for that toller, but it's basically, it's not tied to accounts payable. That's the point I'm trying to make. is we can apply a pretty close standard. We can actually even enter the actual dollar amount against the batch. You can get that far, but we're not doing anything directly to AP.
For the purpose of this, we're talking back flush. Correct.
Could be. So the question was, for this purpose, we're talking about back flushing of costs. You can, and most people do. So back flushing would mean that if you told the system that I made 10 units, I want to apply the standard rate for 10 units that I made. If I made 9 units, I get 9 units worth of cost applied, right? Okay. You can do that. That's how most people start. There are abilities in batch entry to actually enter the actual numbers as well. So if I'm thinking in terms of labor for a second, I keep my example simple. I made 10 units and my standard allocation would be 10 units of dollars. It's 10 hours as an example. To make that, that would be the standard application. It can back flush 10, but you could also go in and override that and say, no, it's really 9.5, it was really 11. But most people do back flush it, at least to get started. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we're going to talk about assigning these in just a second, but let me just talk about the unit cost column that we're seeing here. This is, by and large, is coming directly from your financial system. If you don't do anything else, you just run the report and say, hey, I want a cost roll-up. It will go and look at the inventory budget, inventory evaluation method of each of those items and bring that cost back into the unit cost. So for example, my inventory item for the first item, say the label, a 12-ounce bottle, for example, the first line in there is FIFO in Dynamics. What it'll do is go in, when it runs the report, it goes to Dynamics and says, what is the current cost? That's a term, that's a GP term, or last cost would be an NADSL term. It'll go grab that cost and use that. So an updated cost. So every time I run this, theoretically, this could be different because the costs in Dynamics are changing. Okay. So that's, by and large, that's how it's set, unless you change your options on the report. Okay. So if you've got, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just real quick, you said it pulls the current cost, not the standard cost?
Depends on your, so I'm making the assumption that your item that we're going after to look at, the evaluation method is an actual method, like FIFO, average, last cost. If you're standard, if in the financial system in Dynamics, that item, that raw material is marked as a standard cost item, we'll grab the standard cost field.
Okay.
So we go and look at whatever the valuation method is of that item and bring that back. Okay. That's kind of the default position. There are some exceptions of which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Okay. So therefore, whether it's on this screen, we also see costs on formula management. So when you create a formula, you can also see those costs as well. By and large, these are defaulting to the current cost. So you have an updated cost, a real-time cost. The exception, the asterisk, is if your standard cost. You may not want to do that. So let's talk about where the application of these costs come from. And I'll start, I guess I'll start with the component because that's working down from this report we just looked at. There are some costs that can get assigned directly to the finished product. So I'm just going to bring up my finished product we were just looking at doing the cost roll-up. And I'm going to go to the subcomponent section. This is where we define the bill of material. So these are the component items, the packaging items associated with the finished product. And that's how, from an inventory perspective, that's how they tie together. So this is where they're associated, the inventory item is associated. The cost, or the labor overhead, we call them additional costs, just as a common term. Additional costs are added here in the routing section. So let me back up just briefly and say in the subcomponent section, that's really hard for you to see. I'm sorry, on my screen there's actually a gold bar right here that separates all of this as one section. And that's defining the formula and the fill level of the item. This section is the bill of material, is associating items to that finished product. And then this section right here is what I'm talking about with labor and overhead. And mostly we're talking about this grid right here. So I can add as many additional costs as I would like to this grid. And what I'm talking about when I do this is I'm associating cost with a produced item. Normally that would be a case of beer, a can of paint, a bottle of shampoo, whatever. The end item that's coming out, or the result of a batch. Theoretically, you can do the same thing with an intermediate, but the point I'm trying to say is anything coming out, the end item section of a batch ticket is what I'm talking about. We're applying it based on that. And when I apply those costs, I've got a couple of options to talk about. One is it can be runtime or it can be a setup cost. Runtime means that the value that I'm putting here, the 0.16667, is a value associated with the stocking unit of measure, which is at the top of this screen above an alternate unit of measure. We're talking about this is the amount of time of units that I want to apply to a stocking unit of measure. So in this case, I'm applying 0.16667 of packaging cost ID to this item every time I make it. And to Steve's point earlier, I can have the system backflush, which means it will automatically assign it and I don't have to enter anything. Okay? I could also override that and actually enter the actuals if I want to. So that becomes the quantity side of the equation. The cost is coming from the additional cost ID, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. Okay? So there's a cost behind that, well, I guess it's packaging cost ID that I've got here for some dollar amount. The operation right now is runtime, which means that for every each I get that number. The alternative to that is setup. If I were to set it up as setup, what we're saying is that every batch that I run, it takes me this amount of time, no matter how many I'm making. So think in terms, as the term implies, the setup time of packaging line. That's the idea behind it. Which is really easy from a batch ticket perspective. Basically, we're going to take this quantity times this rate and apply it to the batch cost. Done. The costing side of that's easy from an actual perspective. Theoretical gets a little more difficult because you remember that theoretical costing takes us down to an individual item. So we were talking about a case of beer in the example I was just showing. So therefore, you've got to know what are you allocating this based on. So what is a typical run size? What's a typical batch size? So that I can take a fixed cost and apply it to a variable number. So in this case, I've got, let's say it's $100 of setup costs that I'm taking. What am I allocating that over? Well, that's where we're coming to the capacity field, which is right here. So we're using this capacity field to identify when I go to cost roll-up or when I go to an individual, when I have to allocate this down to an individual item, a setup cost I'm talking about. When I want to allocate a setup cost, I'll use the capacity to say, you know, a typical batch size for me is 500 units, as an example. So what I'm going to do is in cost roll-up, I'm going to use that 500. I'm going to take my total cost of $100, divide it by 500, and come to 20 cents or whatever the number is per unit.
So this capacity that we're using here
Right?
is used only in the report of cost roll-up. It's not actually using it in the actual costing that we're throwing back into GP. This is our examining what our costs are.
That's fair. Because the actual cost, we're talking about setup right now, the actual cost will be calculated based on this quantity times this rate, and here's a dollar amount.
Yeah. So this is just for the reporting so we can break down to the bottle level.
That's right. That's right. I don't know that there's another place, I'm drawing a blank if there is another place it's used, but certainly not in batch costing in the batch itself.
So it breaks down setup costs into quantity.
Per unit, yep. Based on the stocking unit measure, that's right. Okay. So the operation then can be set up or runtime. Okay. And then we have an additional cost ID. This is one of those I don't go in very often, so I can't remember whether we've transitioned it yet. There it is. Good.